Revelations of widespread domestic and foreign surveillance by the NSA has shaken faith in government to historic lows. Classified documents released by whistleblowers like Edward Snowden and Julian Assange reveal a far greater spy system than ever imagined. But the spying going on today is not new. The National Security Agency, FBI, and CIA have been spying on Americans and foreign governments for decades. During the Vietnam War, the NSA tapped the communications of Martin Luther King and Muhammad Ali, among other critics of the conflict. They also spied on the private communications of two sitting U.S. senators, Frank Church of Idaho and Howard Baker of Tennessee, as well as journalists such as Tom Wicker of the New York Times and the Washington Post's Art Buchwald. The spying began well before the Watergate scandal that would lead to Richard Nixon resigning from office. In 1970, news of the government spying on anti-war activists was released to the public by former Army soldier Christopher Pyle. He later served on the Church Committee, which investigated privacy abuses by the agencies. Many people consider him to be an inspiration to modern-day whistleblowers as they expose wrongdoings by corporations and government. Today, he teaches constitutional law and civil liberties at Holyoke College in Massachusetts. Christopher Pyle is our guest today. Welcome to the show, Christopher.
Thank you for inviting me.
Christopher, first question. While serving in the Army, what fueled your suspicions of unnecessary surveillance of Americans publicly coming together for what many in the media regard as public demonstrations?
I didn't suspect it at all, but someone gave me a briefing and showed me the system, and it was quite impressive. The Army had 1,500 plainclothes agents watching every demonstration of 20 people or more, at a giant black warehouse in Baltimore full of files on the lawful political activities of American citizens. It was quite extraordinary. And I disclosed its existence shortly after getting out of the Army, and then recruited 125 of the Army's own agents to tell what they knew about the spying to Congress, the courts, and the press.
Now, let's go back to that.
Yes, go ahead.
What was going on in that warehouse? How many people were there?
Oh, I never counted them. The warehouse had shelves, old warehouse shelves, and they had a cherry picker that ran on rails between the aisles that would go up and pick out boxes full of files on all sorts of people. They had 108 running feet of files on the Communist Party of the United States, most members of whom by that point were dead. But they never know, so they kept those files and added to them.
And you said that they actually had people on the ground at demonstrations?
Yes, all over the country. They had 300 offices coast to coast, 1,500 agents in plain clothes, watching demonstrations, protests, the Poor People's Campaign, Martin Luther King's March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, the protests at the Democratic Convention in 1968. It was quite an extensive operation. Now,
I want to talk more about that and what it means for today's demonstrators, people who go out and peacefully protest certain government programs. But let's go back now. How did you get involved with Senator Sam Ervin's Judiciary Subcommittee on Constitutional Rights?
After I published my first article about the surveillance, they called me.
So they called you, and then how did you get involved? What were the next steps?
Well, they asked me if I could be of help, and I said, I suppose so. And at that point, I began hearing from former agents, because I'd been head of the legal section at the U.S. Army Intelligence School in Baltimore, Maryland. And many of these former agents were former students of mine. They trusted me. They knew I'd rather go to jail than to disclose their identities. And although they expected the government to come down on me, they trusted me to protect their anonymity. So they passed on stories to me, and I connected them with reporters, and I connected them with congressional staff members, and we built the case against Army spying.
Now, in the 70s, you consulted with 3 congressional committees, which led to the passage of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or FISA, which basically outlines the procedures for the collection of foreign intelligence, including American citizens. Can you go into a little bit more detail about FISA and how it's used today?
Well, first, when Congress passed that law, which I opposed, because I thought the warrants were ridiculous. They weren't warrants at all. They were pseudo warrants. And I thought it was an enormous waste of money. But in any case, they were trying to focus the surveillance rather narrowly on embassies and consulates and the so-called legal spies that every country has in the U.S. and that we have in their countries.
So let me go back to, if you were against FISA, do you think that there was already a proper structure in place within government to approve warrants that FISA was basically not needed?
Certainly. It's called the United States court system.
So, in your opinion, do you believe that FISA is more or less just a kangaroo court?
Well, a wallaby court. It's a small operation, but by 2004, it had changed and was authorizing blanket surveillance, the collection of anything and everything by NSA. This was not what we intended. Not at all. And the scale on which NSA now collects information for future use. Back in the 70s, NSA collected information for rather prompt and immediate use. They had people listening and reading and following it. But today, they now store it in a giant warehouse out in Utah, so that if you or I become a person of interest, they can look us up, find out all our connections, all our networks of family and friends, embarrassing information, by listening to conversations or by reading metadata, the phone records. They can follow pretty much who we are and what we do. Now, if they'd had that power when I was investigating them, I don't think I could have pulled it off. They would have contacted my sources and intimidated them into keeping silent. The source-reporter relationship that I had was crucial in that investigation. It was crucial in the work of the Church Committee. We don't have that same capability anymore, and it's very dangerous.
Now, Christopher, how has your perception of the federal government's authority been altered from the moment you went from an Army soldier to an investigator consulting with congressional committees?
I don't think it changed a great deal. By that point, I had gone to college, graduated from law school, gotten a master's degree in public law and government, and begun a PhD in politics. So none of this came as an enormous surprise to me, and I'd read enough American history to know that if the power is there, it will be used, and probably for corrupt ends unless we check it. So I simply tried to check it.
Now, the federal law that was established in '78 has obviously been altered due to the attacks on September 11th. For example, the USA Patriot Act has significantly increased the government's authority over surveillance of all Americans. National security letters can be issued, and you have no recourse. You can't even speak about receiving them. What are your thoughts about the newly added powers in this new American century?
I think it's extremely unwise, but it's what members of Congress do in a time of crisis. George Orwell warned us against crisis government. Where you have crisis government, you have no restraint on abuses of power. And we now have perpetual war that promises perpetual peace, but essentially is perpetual war. And with that, we have very little oversight and very little critical capabilities. The founders understood this danger. They saw the British government in perpetual war with France because of continual crisis politics. They didn't want to be part of that. That was one reason for the American Revolution, to get away from that kind of crisis government, to have a system where you would have separate branches checking and balancing each other and knowing what the others were doing. They had no idea that we would have this kind of unaccountable government. That was the furthest thing from their mind. But we now have it, and it's all because people are telling us they're trying to keep us safe. Well, I want to know who's keeping us safe from ourselves, because we're as incapable of abusing power as anybody else. The framers knew that. We should understand it, and we should check it.
Do you think the American people are informed enough to check government? Or are they just following along?
Well, it depends on which American people you're talking about. There are a lot of us who understand pretty much what's going on, And Ed Snowden and Bradley Manning have certainly helped us understand what's going on. And some independent media have helped us to understand what is going on. Our corporate media has done less in this regard, and that's unfortunate.
Now, Christopher, I want to talk about the NSA spying on foreign governments. We're coming up on a break. I also want to talk more about Edward Snowden and Bradley Manning, the whistleblowers of the 21st century. But we do need to take that break. Stay tuned for more. We're talking with Christopher Pyle right here on WHDT World News.